So if you can't get other people on your side, it's probably not going to happen. Somebody else has to be vested in this, whether it's a colleague or an employee or your boss or an investor, somebody. You can't do it by yourself. It's just, unless it's a one-person-sized dream. That's why a lot of innovators go into the arts. They make a painting, they take a picture, they make a sculpture, they write a book, they write a play. They don't need anybody's permission. They just go in their bedroom or their office or on a dock, and they just do it. But if you're going to try to do it in a group of people, you need to be able to deal with a group, and that means you have to actually like people, and they have to like you. If you don't get along with the rest of the human race, you're going to have a really hard time innovating, because you have to raise friends before you raise money. You have to raise good vibes before anybody wants to hang out with you. And if they don't want to hang out with you, innovation takes a lot of time. So you really have to kind of work on it. And you can't pretend that you like people if you don't like people. If you really don't like people, and you go out and you just glad hand them and you're insincere, they can tell. People are not stupid. So if you really think that you want to have a future in innovating and creating things, and you really think that you would rather be by yourself and not have relationships with people, you might want to write a book instead of like making a product or a process or a system. Last one. So the champion has to be like all these things, the operator, aggregator, executor. It's hard to be a champion. Most people do not actually have it in them. Champions stand out. It's not a simple thing. And you can't bullshit it. You really do have to be authentic, or you won't have any stakeholders. If you go out and tell people a bunch of lines of stuff and you can't back it up, people are going to drill down to make sure that they're not taking a risk by hanging out with somebody who's going to try to do something that they don't have the answers and they really can't be truthful. So you really have to be real. If you're not real, you're probably going to have a very tough time.
Howard, before you go on,
sure.
We go back to innovation product.
Yeah.
Insight, I understand. Execution, I understand. Most of the time, I hear about branding from an advertising world, positioning one's product.
Right.
So we're talking now about positioning one's idea, one's innovation. Is that the thinking?
Yes. It has
I've got
to
do three things. Now I have to come up with the original idea.
Right.
I also must know how to deliver that idea. But even knowing how to deliver it, I got to choose the right positioning to deliver. What I find happens, so many people get excited and so convicted about what they're doing that I can't wait to share it with somebody. I don't care who it is, where. You've got to think this is the best thing since sliced bread, because I do too. End of issue. Then I get turned down and I go back sulking. Disillusioned.
But that also goes back to the art, because it's not
Absolutely.
It's about
Absolutely. Yes,
getting
sir.
people to understand it's the why behind it. Why should I care? Helping them with that.
Yes,
I mean,
sir.
that's all about the art.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I want to go back to a comment that was made in the last group about our innovation problems in Afghanistan and Iraq. I would kind of disagree with that. I think we were innovating all over the place. I just came from commanding a battalion in Afghanistan, and there was innovation going on at the grassroots level all over. Where we struggled was the institutionalizing that innovation. And I think it goes back to this point of branding. I couldn't put my finger on it until you brought it up. There's a culture in our Army that discourages, it's seen as self-promotion. And the promotion of an idea is necessarily the promotion of the individual who came up with the idea. So we tend to, those who are trying, the mavens and the advocates who come up with new ideas tend to be kind of silenced, because there's a perception that that's self-serving, when in many cases it's not. If you look at the Center for Army Lessons Learned, they've been trying to fight that process. But I think we struggle not in the innovation itself, because we have a lot of smart guys who are innovating. We struggle in making that part of the institution and sharing that knowledge across the organization.
And taking his point to the next level, people see your desire to change as a critique of them, as opposed to 2.0 of the idea. So what happens is, and that's why a lot of people have a problem with the word disruptive, because you're talking about saying, you stink, we're going to fix you. And really what you're saying is, you're okay, let's make you better. Which again is branding, but it's also a matter of saying, the human condition side, and the lesson learned does not mean you sucked at it. And unfortunately, that's what our lesson learned program tends to do. It's a matter of saying, lesson observed, what do we do next? And then take the innovation and brand it into an idea of saying, I'm better, I'm going to make you better. The BASF thing, I love that. We do what you do better.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that part of the art is many times getting your customer, whoever that might be a part of that new innovation. To have them think it's part of their idea as well, so we can work it from a two-way street.
And that's the single most important thing, what you just said. You can't expect the person who didn't have this idea to come to where you are. You have to go to where they are. You have to make these ideas relevant from their perception. They can't possibly know what you're talking about. You've got to put it within the context of what they're thinking about and what matters to them. Otherwise, it's not relevant. So, branding is kind of like a blasphemous assertion. It's a word that, as a physicist and an engineer, I was allergic to for 20 years. I mean, if I thought, oh, that's a dirty word, that's like sales and marketing, I don't want to do that. I'm a science guy, I'm all about the truth. So if you don't like the word branding, just substitute the word perception. You have to think about how other people are perceiving what you're saying, as Gary was saying. Otherwise, they may not get what you're talking about. So you have to put yourself in the other person's position. It's not just about being right. It's about being where there's a psychological dimension to innovation. There's a dimension of relationship and communication and context and going to where you're a customer or the end user. You have to get out of yourself. So it's absolutely not about pushing yourself and self-aggrandizing. It's about finding a way that the idea is providing value to somebody else.
Most investors, like venture capitalists, they want you to explain your technology in about 5 minutes. What do you think about that?
I think you gave the answer back there when you said you need a prototype. You actually gave the answer to that question, that without a demo or a prototype or something that you could show somebody, they won't ever know what you're talking about. You can talk for a really long time, and then you build the prototype and you show it to them, and they always say to you, oh, why didn't you say that? But when you show it to them, so you're the one who answered that question.
As a young JO, I came up with a simple model in communicating to give briefings and so forth by using a simple model of 4 questions. What, so what, now what, and what's missing. And by going through those 4 questions and looking at it like a coin, what does it mean to the customer and what does it mean to me? And going through a list of the questions generated by those, you almost always can get their buy-in. You establish under the what, here's statements of fact. Not emotion, but statements of fact. The so what is, why is this important to me? Why is it important to them? And establish where you can connect with your other party. But now what are the next right steps? And then what's missing is a great opportunity to brainstorm with your customer about what have we missed? Where are we missing the opportunity? And it's just a simple model. Because even I can remember what, so what, now what, and what's missing. And always put yourself in the presentation that way, and you usually will hit the mark. And it's something that an executive can understand if you keep it down to those few bullets.
So, this is the only slide that has this many words on it. But it's really important. If there isn't a champion for an idea, it is dead. It is just not going to happen. Somebody actually has to go out there and take this on and say, I'm responsible for this. People don't talk about it that much, but within innovation there is a responsibility. You have the responsibility to be the mother of that child. It's going to die. It is absolutely going to die unless you take care of it. So this art of championing, it doesn't matter whether it's a gigantic or a tiny organization. Somebody has to be the champion. Somebody has to say, I really care about this, demonstrate that grit, keep on going, find a way to adapt what they're saying, or it's just not going to happen. And here's the dangerous part, the last part. It could be risky business. Taking that stand, an unpopular stand, you get in trouble. And you do get in trouble. And you have to learn how to not mind that much that you got in trouble. So if you derive your self-esteem and your self-value from what the rest of the world says, you're going to have a hard time being a champion. You have to be kind of internally feeding yourself with, yeah, this makes sense, I'm going to do it anyway, even if it's not popular, I may not be getting the right messages, because it is risky, and if you really are judging yourself based on what other people say about you, you probably can't be a champion. So it's an opportunity for growth, because the average person who has a great idea and starts executing, and then they find themselves where they have to sort of put up or shut up, and they're thinking, well, it would be much easier to go off and have another idea, or just do my job, or do the thing that they want me to do. It's an opportunity for growth. Being a champion is really a chance to step up. So here's the problem. If you're going to go around making noises about things that are invisible, people are going to tell you that you're crazy. If I walk into this room and I see 1,000 things, and a normal person walks into the room and sees 100 things, and I start talking about the 900 things which nobody else sees, which is the test, the innovator insight test, then people are going to say you're insane, because you're so vested in a bunch of stuff that I can't see and I can't experience. And this is the problem that people with insight frequently have. They're talking about stuff that is just not perceivable, and other people think that you're nuts. And what's nice about this conference is you guys have assembled a really smart group of people. So it is kind of safe here to say things that are invisible, and other people will get it. But that's not true for most of the world. Most of the world, you start talking about invisible stuff, and they're going to say that you're loony. You need to be able to deal with people who have enough conceptual abstraction to infer from the things that they can see what a possibility is. So this communication thing, the context, timing, activity, you have to manage a lot of stuff. You have to manage how people are experiencing and feeling about it, what order you deliver the information, whether it's branding or perception, whatever the words are, you've got to become really good at communication. There's no way around it, especially because you're talking about what people can't experience unless they build a prototype. But you even need some resources to get a prototype. So normally you can't make the prototype by yourself, so you need some stakeholders, you need some money, and you've got to talk people into giving you the resources so you could make a proof of concept so that you can show people that you're not entirely nuts. Questions? Okay, keep going. So these are some of the behaviors that champions actually manifest. I don't need to say them, you can see them all. The important one is the keep yourself positive and strong. This was originally a keynote presentation in the Mac, which meant that there were things flying around in transitions and orders in which things are coming up. So this is just PDFs now. So I just have to point out that keep yourself positive and strong. If you don't, that's the key one. Because you keep on assuming that somebody's going to either pat you on the back or say this is a really great idea and keep going, and it may take a few years. Because until you establish trust, nobody's going to give you positive feedback. And even after you establish trust, they still may not give you positive feedback too. Unfortunately, the world is not very nurturing to those who rock the boat. It's more nurturing to people who color between the lines and follow the steps and do everything you're supposed to do. You looked like you were going to, did you have something to say? Okay. So, because of that, you have to develop what I call an adversity quotient. You have to be willing to submit an idea a lot of times, and people say no a lot of times, because they will. I want to just give a couple of anecdotes. So in around, 1980, I thought the world needed a digital piano, and I got hired by Bose. I was an acoustician, and I spent 5 years trying to convince Amar Bose that the world needed a digital piano. And he said, why did the world need a digital piano? I said, because there are more piano players in the world than any other instrumentalist, and pianos aren't portable. So the average musician that goes and plays in a club on a Friday night or a Saturday night, if they play a guitar or a trumpet or a flute or anything, they could bring their own instrument, but a piano player can't. So the piano player gets to the club. This goes to the point of innovating, having a problem to solve. The problem to solve is if you're a piano player and you go to a club, the piano's generally busted. Some of the keys don't work, the piano's out of tune, it doesn't work. So I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a piano that I could actually lift and bring with me, just like all the other musicians in the world. But Dr. Bose, Elmar Bose, said, what a stupid idea. Who in the world would need a digital piano? What are you talking about? I said, well, there are 52 million amateur musicians in the United States, and 30 million of them play the piano. That's it. 30 million people play the piano in the United States. Pianos have life expectancies of 100 years, longer than people do. So wouldn't it be great to have one that didn't go out of tune, it was portable, you could plug it into a computer, had a headphone jack, all those inherent advantages of an electronic system. He said, absolutely not, shouldn't do it. So I didn't listen, and I built prototypes. And over a period of 5 years, eventually I talked people outside of Bose into giving me $2 million to do a joint venture to put the Bose logo on a piano by a company called Cogswell, if any of you know about the music world, and then a company called Sonic. So I got to build it, but the chairman of the board absolutely prohibited me from doing it. He said, you can't do it. But I got air cover. I got the president of the company to say, yeah, that would be a cool idea. So he gave me the $250,000 to build the prototype, even though the chairman of the board said, don't do it, we're not in that business, we make loudspeakers, we don't make pianos, Lieberman's crazy, don't do it. But I said to the president, wouldn't you like to see the Bose logo on a piano? Because I think that the market for digital pianos is probably $1 billion a year, $2 billion a year, because there are 30 million piano players, and pianos need, anyway. Took 5 years. For 5 years, they told me I was an idiot. From 80 to 85, and 85, they said, you're a genius, let's ship it. They said, by the way, how did you build a product without a budget? Who worked on this? And then the chief engineer said, well, we've noticed that about 30% of the engineering budget vanished, and that people's man hours that we thought were working on all the other products we were working on, whenever we couldn't find anybody, they were in Lieberman's lab. So we came to the conclusion that he must have spent a couple $1 million of other people's time that we're not supposed to be spending it on this. And then I got yelled at again by the chairman. He said, I told you not to do this, why did you do this? I said, well, the power of an idea is that it takes on a life of its own, and people want to embrace an idea, and that's what you have to do. There's a little bit of seduction involved. If you want to innovate something, you need to sort of seduce people, they're not getting anything from me, they're just getting some meaning in their life by working on something that they think matters to them. So, but for 5 years, it took 5 years, even though we did have email and I could send communications. It took 5 years because, okay, so here's the reason why you need stakeholders, because the champion has to do all of these things, and you can't. There are too many roles. Champions have to do all of this stuff. That's why you need a team. The cognitive limits of a person are exceeded at some point. One person can do a lot of stuff, but they can't do everything. Cognitive limits of an organization get exceeded. Cognitive limits of a particular service. And that's why we have an Air Force and a Navy. One group can't do the whole thing. That's why there has to be a team. If you're going to be a champion, well, you're going to end up having to be a leader. Because you're going to need to lead somebody more than yourself, because you just can't do all of this stuff, and it just takes time. And that's where the stakeholders come in. The stakeholders do a lot of the things that were on the other page, because you can't do all this stuff, but they can. And stakeholders can be short term. They don't have to be around for a long time. So even if you're an engineering nerd like me, and you said, I don't want to be a manager, and I don't want to be a leader, and I certainly don't want to do sales, and I absolutely don't want to do marketing or branding, I don't care about any of that stuff. Well, I ended up doing all of it because I needed stakeholders, and I needed to talk people into stuff. And during those 5 years that Elmar Bose was telling me, don't make a piano, there must have been 30 different people that helped me along the way, including the vice president of sales, and the vice president of marketing, and the president, and the chief engineer, so that when Elmar Bose would say, what is Lieberman doing in his lab? I got a lot of air cover. People said, well, he's doing something, and it'll probably turn out okay, leave him alone. So this whole business of air cover is really, really important. If you're going to try to do something disruptive in a large organization, hopefully there'll be somebody a couple of levels above you that can look down and go, that person maybe needs a few more degrees of freedom than a normal person. Like, I won't hold them to exactly to task, You can't do it by yourself. You can't convince a giant organization to do something unless somebody who's senior can have enough discrimination to say, I got a whole lot of people under me, but I'm going to let some of them have a little bit more degrees of freedom than another. And this is kind of tough, especially in the government, where a lot of times the assumption is that people are replaceable. Everybody who's at a certain level, like all captains can do what all captains can do, and all lieutenant colonels can do what. Well, people are not exactly totally replaceable. They are different, and you need to give people a little bit more freedom, but not everybody, because you can't give everybody freedom, because then the whole system breaks down. A lot of people need to do the thing that we need them to do. But you can't give nobody freedom, because if you give nobody freedom, then there won't be any innovation. You can't give everybody freedom, because the whole system just breaks. You can't give nobody freedom, because that's even more risky than giving too much freedom. So if one erred in the direction of allowing a few people to mess around, knowing that they might have some failures. And this requires, that senior person to be kind of special, because they have to take a chance. And not everybody's willing to do that. And by the way, you can't really go select that air cover. It has to select you. You do your thing, and you hope that somebody might notice that what you're doing could be useful, and they'll come and talk to you and go, you need a little bit of help. I notice you're struggling down here trying to make this thing happen. So without air cover, I would have never been able to do any of the things I tried to do. Always somebody somewhere said, that might be useful, like leave them alone. And when I worked at Apple, I got called into the vice president of engineering's office, and he said, I just want to let you know that you're not manageable. You don't take orders. You don't do anything that people tell you to do. And I said, oh, okay. So do you want me to stop what I'm doing? He said, no. You shipped 6 products in 18 months. Nobody ever did that before in history. But we want to let you know that you're really not very good at taking orders. Now, I'm not trying to cause insurrection. There has to be a chain of command in the military. The military is not Apple Computer. But they had what I call a culture of innovation there, where it was okay for some people to be wacky and screwballs. And they called me and said, you are a lousy employee. You just don't listen. But you outperform everybody else by a whole lot, so we're going to just leave you alone. And another part of this process is the patent attorneys were always chasing me around saying, you have to write all the stuff down that you're doing because we need to file a whole pile of patents. And I kind of didn't cooperate. I didn't write it all down. And the vice president called me in again and he said, why aren't you writing this stuff down? I said, you told me that I shouldn't stop what I'm doing, that I should do the thing that I am doing. If I spend the next 6 months documenting things, then I won't be able to create a whole bunch of new things. Why don't you get somebody else to write it down? So a lot of those things didn't get patented. And in Apple land, it didn't matter because the technology was changing so rapidly that since it took the US government 5 years to issue the patent on the things that I was doing, by the time the patent came out, the thing didn't matter because we had already moved way past that in terms of product. So even though the conventional terms would have been for a high-tech company, patent, I said, well, I don't know. I don't think it's that relevant because everything that we're shipping today in 3 years won't matter anymore. And they allowed me to do it. So if you are an innovation champion and you're doing the stakeholder thing and this leadership thing and describing the invisible and building prototypes, that's where innovation culture comes from. That's why companies like Apple had Steve Jobs and Bose had Amar Bose. And I was fortunate to work for 2 companies for 15 years who really had an innovation culture where they thought that it was a good idea to rock the boat. Now, they were not normal companies. I had it easy. I mean, I would have probably not been able to get away with breaking so many rules had I not been in 2 companies that had an innovation culture because the founder, who was the chairman of the board, wanted to be a revolutionary. They wanted to be disruptive. They were not looking for evolution. They were not looking for incremental innovation. They were actually looking for revolutions. And Amar Bose, once I tried to sort of follow orders and do something that I thought they would really want me to do, And I brought something into him, and I got yelled at. He said, I don't want you making any products that look like they could have been made by any other company. I want you to only make revolutions. I said, why is that? I'm trying to actually be a good corporate citizen and do the thing that you told me to do for like once. How come that's backfiring? He said, well, it's really simple. I was an MIT professor when I was 34, and I was fully tenured, and I had a pretty high quality life. I was surrounded by smart people. I was having a good time. And then I decided that stereos didn't sound any good, so I started an audio company. But I still liked hanging out with the kind of people that I was with at MIT. And I figured that if I wanted to have this kind of a staff, I needed to pay a little bit above what the market value was to be surrounded by these elite people. And I couldn't have the profit margin to pay for these elite people unless I could deliver a premium product, which couldn't really be a mass consumer thing. So I knew I could charge a premium to have higher margins, so I could spend more on R&D, so that I could hire people like you, so that I could enjoy going to the lunchroom because I could hang out with the same kind of people that I was hanging out with MIT. And he said that's why we get accused of being too expensive at Bose. We have a 68% profit margin, much, much higher than the rest of the audio industry. He said, but that's also why we are larger than the other 299 loudspeaker companies in the United States. We have a greater dollar volume than. There were 300 loudspeaker companies. Bose does more business than the other 299 companies. And he had a higher margin. And it was totally selfish. He said, I want to hang out with smart people at lunchtime. So I can't do that unless I have a high profit margin. So that's why I don't want you to do anything that's not a revolution. So that was a serious culture of innovation. He didn't want anybody doing ordinary stuff. And that meant a lot of things that we did fail, too. But he was prepared to live with that because that was his values. So these are some of the kind of oxymoronic sounding attributes of an innovation culture. Each one of them you could think about for a little while. Focused yet opportunistic. Wait a minute, people who are focused are like doing the thing that they're supposed to do. How could you be opportunistic but be focused? Well, in an innovation culture, you actually have to balance these two things, which might not seem like they were the same thing. A lot of times people who take initiative do it in private. They think creativity is a solo, solitary thing. How could you be a communicator while you're busy, like, taking initiative? Well, as we said before, if you don't communicate, then nobody will know what initiative you're taking, and it won't matter anyway. So, I'll just say one more. The collaborate center is risk prudent. Risk prudent, that sounds like an oxymoron by itself. You're not going to innovate without risk. There's just no way. You're going to get in trouble. Somebody's going to get in trouble. Somebody's going to lose money. People are going to get pissed off. But there are certain risks that are worth taking and others that are not. And you have to actually learn how to assess, should I take this risk or not? Can you eliminate risk? Is there a formula I could tell you? No. And SVII, we had people from a lot of countries show up who are ministers of innovation. The minister, Sweden has an organization called Vinnova, the Swedish Ministry of Innovation. And the Swedish Minister of Innovation flew to Silicon Valley to talk to me to say, what's the formula for innovation? So that's not how it works. She said, we don't want to make any mistakes in Sweden. We're perfectionists. We're not. Tell us what the formula is and we'll execute. I said, what are you talking about? You have Volvo and so you have so many companies that did all these breakthrough things. And she said, yeah, but we're losing all of them because they're being purchased by outside Sweden. They're being purchased by Americans and by Russians and by other companies. So we're losing our innovation base. So we need to renew our innovation culture. So tell us what the formula is and we'll do it. I said, no, that's not the nature of innovation. She said, well, you started 8 companies. Like, what algorithm did you follow? I said, a different thing every time. Creative people don't do the same thing over and over and over. They do different things depending on what the circumstances are. They don't do the same thing all the time. I'm a jazz musician. I can't even play the same notes twice. I got in trouble with my piano teacher when I was 10 years old because I got to the beat sign at the bottom of the page and I came up to the top and played different notes. And they slapped my wrist and they said, you're making a mistake. I said, no, I just played it right the first time. This is the second time. I get a turn. I said, why do you get a turn? You're only 10 years old. So why don't I get a turn? What's wrong with my notes? They sound okay to me. They sound roughly equivalent to those notes. And they said, I'm not going to have a philosophical debate with a 10-year-old about why you should get a turn or not. And then, so I stopped playing for 7 or 8 years because I got told that I was the jerk and I shouldn't do it. So that's why I didn't become a music major and I became a physicist instead. So all of these things, I think, are you guys going to distribute these PowerPoints and things? If anybody wants them, you don't have to necessarily write this down.
Yeah.
You can distribute. They're also on the back of my business card. So if you want them, I actually put these on the back of my card because I think that it's a lot easier to innovate in an innovation culture. If you're surrounded by people who think innovation is a really good idea, then you get less resistance. So the challenge is, how do you create an innovation culture within the DoD? Well, I mean, you can do that. DARPA is pretty world-class at innovation. The DoD does incredible amounts of innovation. You guys are actually very, very, very good at innovation. But how do you change the culture so that it's like more acceptable? And I think you are actually the population that is changing this culture.
Can you kind of address the differences between product innovation, which I think a lot of this speech is focused on, and process, which I think a lot of the folks in the room are focused on? You still need champions, you still need budgets, you still need stakeholders, but there is a substantial difference between how you're informing the way bureaucracy operates and how you bring a product to market or a missile to the DoD.
So, yeah, that's a very good question, and I actually teach a semester-long course called Iceberg. It stands for Imagine, Scope, Plan, Execute, and Review. And I actually came up with a process that applies from everything to a website to a battleship. Because there are the same things that actually have to happen, whether it's a product or a process. I called this the P5 mechanism. It was about problems, programs, processes, products, and prototypes. And there were still a bunch of steps that were the same. And it's easier to talk about products because there's a tangible manifestation that you can give a demo and show people. But as we've moved from a hardware world to a software world, and systems integration is providing more of the value add from the software, which is the connective tissue between all the hardware components, software is a process. Software is not hardware. Software is a process. And the whole agile development process for software development, the minimum viable product, just shippable thing. So some of the steps in this process, whether it's hardware or software, is, well, first you just sort of start with your imagination. What is the problem that you're trying to solve, and what's the solution that you could imagine? There could be a problem that needs a process instead of a problem that needs a product just as often. In fact, even to make good hardware, you need a better hardware development process. So process is what underlies it, but you have to not be overly attached to your process. So you have a process and you lay out a bunch of steps and you write your plan and you're moving down it, but then reality happens. It's like your plan doesn't survive contact with the enemy, and your business plan doesn't survive contact with the marketplace for the same reason. Reality doesn't actually care what your set of steps are. So you start going down the set of steps. The first step is you imagine it, you write it down, you communicate it, you share it, just like that lieutenant did with the continuously aiming. But then you get feedback. So here's where somebody had mentioned John Boyd. Have you all heard of an OODA loop? The Air Force observe. Okay, so it's how you aim. It's an OODA loop. An OODA loop is a feedback loop. And if any of you have studied engineering, if you have a complex system, you need a feedback loop, otherwise the system goes unstable. And the OODA loop is to make you sort of hit the target. Your process needs to be in a loop. It needs to be in something very much like an OODA loop, where you're going through your steps and then you're observing what happens, and things don't work out the way you thought they were going to work out, and you make correction based on your observation. You take this error signal and you feed it back into the process, and then you alter the process so that it's no longer the wrong process, because the process that you started on and the process that you end up completing in your execution is generally not the same process. And this is what DARPA's secret is. DARPA, normal DoD programs could be like 10 years long, but DARPA programs are more like 3 years long. So they throw together these teams and they make up a process for that particular project, and they don't use that same process for a different project. DARPA, why on earth DARPA brought in a guy from Silicon Valley who's like an Apple engineer? I'm totally out of the ballpark for them. I didn't have a military service record. I wasn't an academic. I was an entrepreneur. Well, I was the dean of a college also once, but I still wasn't an academic. But DARPA is willing to call upon people from anywhere and make up a process for what that particular situation needs to be. Now the problem is that you end up with a bunch of building blocks instead of with a bunch of systems. And for you guys, you actually want systems that are going to serve the warfighter out in the field by doing something. And these processes that the government uses ends up resulting in a lot of pieces of the puzzle, but they don't necessarily put the puzzle together. So there's a good on-ramp. DARPA is a great on-ramp, but there isn't an off-ramp. There isn't a transition plan necessarily.
I think, kind of going off what you were saying, is the difference between institutionalizing innovation and institutionalizing innovations. Like a lot of what the military does with like lessons learned and that sort of stuff is that we institutionalize them in new TTPs, add requirements to training blocks and that kind of stuff. And so the next guys do what was innovative last year, the guys do, but that might not fit the exact situation, What was innovative and saved lives and worked in Iraq doesn't apply to Afghanistan. And so it's not about institutionalizing necessarily the innovations that a junior officer or NCO or someone comes up with. It's institutionalizing the process that allows them to come up with a solution for their specific circumstances in the place that they're at the time that they're there.
Right.
And obviously like lessons learned is important because getting it to someone else that might be useful to them in their situation. But what's useful for a Marine in the Sangin Valley might not be useful in Kabul. So institutionalizing a lesson learned in Helmand could be worthless in other parts of the same war.
I've got three, but you hadn't spoken yet, so.
Yeah, sorry. So you mentioned earlier, and this is building off what you said there, that innovation is an art, right? And I'm of the belief that you could paint, you could teach anybody to paint, but you can't teach somebody to be Picasso. And there are those of us throughout the military that are naturally better innovators than others, right? Walk into a room, see all the problems that are invisible to everybody else. And these are the people I believe that we need to find, isolate, and put them in Afghanistan and Iraq to see these problems, because we're trying to write down the list. We're trying to write down a tacit list, and tacit knowledge is so deeply embedded in us, we can't even find the words. We got PowerPoints trying to describe this invisible art, when in reality, it's built into those of us who are naturally inclined to be innovators. So I think one of the biggest problems we have in the military is just, okay, you 506s go innovate randomly, random people, when in reality they have, whether medium, low, high, on the innovation scale. And those of us who are more inclined to be highly innovative, we're overlooked, for whatever reason.
So some thoughts about that. First thing is, when you encounter a 3 or 4 year old, they all appear to be innovative. They paint, they draw, they sing, they do everything. Adults can suck the fun out of everything. The problem is that when you get old enough, you've had so many messages that told you not to sing and dance and take chances, that by the time you become an adult, you go, I'm not going there. So the innovator is the person who didn't listen to those messages that said you shouldn't do it. I do think it is an inherent capability in all human beings to be able to innovate, because innovation is kind of a fancy word for adapting. I mean, we all adapt to situations. We're not the strongest, fastest, we can't fly. We're not the organism that should be dominating the planet, except for the fact that we're better at adapting than any other organism. So if you just thought of how well can somebody adapt as related to how well they can innovate, so yeah, I do think some people are definitely better at it than others. I mean, my DNA is so hardwired toward innovation that I have a hard time doing something when I know that it's the right thing to do, because my wife teases me if I drive someplace, I don't drive back the same way that I got there. Like if I do come back the same way that I drove there, she says, "What's wrong? Are you not feeling it? You ordinarily never take the same path twice." So I have the disease. Like I'm overly stuck with this. But I think it's mostly because my parents didn't suck all the fun out of it. My parents told me it was okay and permissible to have ideas. So although I don't think you can tell people, okay, innovate now because you're in the job of innovation, I think that you could assume a lot more people have the potential to innovate than you might think if they didn't get it beat out of them. So.
And I think you focused on a lot of, you brought Boyd into this quite well, but I think for the crowd that may not be as familiar, don't get lost in just the decision cycle part of Buddha. The champion of the cause or innovation that you talked about for the vast majority of this, it's about that leader's orientation. And that's really the richness of what Boyd, I think, really brought differently to a feedback loop. So a lot of innovation is important, but understanding yourself so that you can bring out those salient things and being the champion that you need to be is really important to that.
Right, it's the reality part of the equation. That's really important because innovators have a tendency to live in the world of potential and visible, but without the reality, in that special kind of a feedback loop, you're in dangerous territory. You could be off doing stuff that's just not fun.
I think most of the people in this room were bred to face challenges / problems / issues in a creative way. And I would submit that there's at least 4 dimensions that one has to consider. There's the people dimension, there's the process dimension, there's the technology or product dimension, and there's the investment. And each of those dimensions have various levels of maturity. And if you don't line up well in setting and managing expectations with the folks that you're trying to serve or you're trying to sell to, it's going to be a problem. So there, you need to achieve a certain level of capability and maturity
absolutely.
to be able to be successful and be able to take a look at it across those 4 dimensions as a minimum.
Expectation awareness and management are crucial.
Absolutely. That's
if you don't manage the expectation, and by the way, people's expectations change because reality changes. So it's not a thing you do once. Oh, let's set those expectations. It's that, well, we were going to deliver this milestone in 3 weeks, but 2 weeks into the 3 weeks, you go, oh shit, we're not. You better tell people not the day that you didn't meet the deadline. You better tell them the day that you found out that you weren't going to meet the deadline so that they're not really upset about it. So there were a few more questions.
Sure. Just a quick question because you had mentioned that DARPA is really great at building the building blocks, but not necessarily the platform. And I found that very true on a lot of, we're both pilots, and a lot of the innovations that come from these labs, they say, hey, this is going to change the way that you do things. But they've never actually had a pilot on the team. It'd be much like you creating a digital piano, but knowing nothing about music.
Right.
Like you might know how to do it technically, but actually understanding that passion and the nuances and, hey, does this sound good to my ear? Is that, do you feel that that's something maybe that DARPA is lacking because, or is that, because you mentioned that they're not.
It's 2 slides from now, exactly that.
Okay.
I agree 100%, and I'm going there. But a couple more people had some questions.
So I wanted to talk about briefly in some of these, in looking at disruption is really basically creativity at scale. Keeping the integrity of a process or a concept through all the stakeholders and other champions that are bringing on board, and retaining that sort of initial integrity of what we're trying to go at.
Yeah, so one of the roles I didn't put down, which you're absolutely right about, for the champion is the defender of the integrity of the project, the process, and the dream. And that's why when the founder of a company dies and they bring in new management, it hardly ever is as good as it was before. Because the founder is the one who was defending the integrity of, why did they start this in the first place? They know why they did it. We were talking about this over at breakfast. Amar Bose is dead, Steve Jobs is dead, Sidney Harman is dead. A lot of the leaders in the whole technology and computer industry have all died. Maybe Larry Ellison's the one who's left. But this business of integrity, this is a complicated process. So the word integrity, integral, and integration, these concepts are really connected. You've got to be a system integrator if you're going to be an innovator. But you have to have some integrity about the process because somebody has to defend it because it gets attacked from a lot of different quarters. So you have to have a really clear sense of what am I doing and why am I doing it and how does this all fit together. And you have to defend that integrity. And that is actually a hard thing to do, especially if a venture capitalist comes to you and you made a pitch. You said, I built a prototype and I need a couple of $1 million because I want to turn the prototype into a company. And the venture capitalist says, I'll give you $5 million if you could do it in 6 months. You said it was going to take you 2 years, and I don't have 2 years, so do it in 6 months. And the average 30-year-old, when the VC dangles the check for $5 million over there, they go, okay, I'll do it. But they gave up on the integrity of it because they can't do it. You can't do it in 6 months instead of 2 years because it's actually impossible. But when the investors start to pressure the innovators, and this is one of the reasons why the government does a better job of breakthrough innovation in some ways than the VC-funded things. VCs are good innovation managers, but they're not necessarily good research managers. DARPA does breakthrough stuff because they're looking 10 years out, not 18 months out. So you guys actually are the source of some of the bigger picture ideas. So since I've got 5 minutes, let me get to those 2 slides, which were, okay. This is a quick test which you can ask yourself about your department or your group. Are these things going on? So I'm not going to stay on it long, but these are some questions you can ask yourself about. Are the conditions that support innovation happening where you are? These are like some of those things. But since we've only got 5 minutes, I'm going to go to this next part. Okay. Relationships, not process, there's not an algorithm, there are a lot of rules of thumb. This is important. It's qualitative, not quantitative. For a group of people who are assuming that qualitative is the way to go, art is not qualitative. Art is not quantitative, it is qualitative. Sorry. It's about quality. Innovation's about quality. It's not about quantity. It has nothing to do with quantity at all. The Chinese are about quantity. How do we make more of these things faster? Maybe I'm still standing now. Oh, no, it just went right here. Okay. So we were talking about the feedback loop, and to your point about, like, who's the pilot here anyway? And when people design pianos and they're not piano players, they generally don't work. No, it's not very good. So one really good way to be in a feedback loop is, so here's sort of like a challenge I'm kind of throwing out to the group. When Ben and his cohorts were sort of putting this whole thing together, and I said, so what are you going to do between the 2013 conference and the 2014 conference? How are you going to build momentum? What are you going to work on? He said, I don't know, do you have any ideas? I said, yeah, I do have an idea. To your point, DARPA doesn't have a feedback loop. DARPA has 50 engineers and 1 pilot. So I'm working on a thing called PCAS, Persistent Close Air Support, and there's like 1 pilot. But there are 49 engineers and process people. I go, what are you talking about? You should have 50 pilots and 1 engineer. You got the whole equation upside down. You need a feedback loop where, since this group of people is a more kind of elite group than your average group in the government, you're articulate and you're educated and you're experienced and you are the right people to deliver the feedback to DARPA about, are you doing the wrong thing or the right thing? And how will you take these building blocks and integrate it into a system? So when I go to DARPA and to Raytheon and to the subs that Boeing and Lockheed, they'll go, well, yeah, we don't have enough input. Because when I pointed out to them that they weren't iterating quickly enough to the hardware versus software thing, I said, do you guys make a new iteration every year? You know, in Israel, they make 3 iterations a day. They're a software company. They do 3 software releases a day. Raytheon, you do it once in 365 days. Israel does it 3 times. They're 1,000 times. They're iterating 1,000 times faster than you are. And because of my presence at DARPA, I've been sort of pushing Raytheon. Now they're doing it 17 times a year. They're doing it every 3 weeks instead of every year. So I sped them up by a factor of 17. But the key to iterating and to speeding up is to have a feedback loop. So, but the feedback loop has to be a high bandwidth, high speed. It has to be a high quality feedback, because giving feedback if you're not articulate isn't that useful. So if a pilot says, well, I just don't like this isn't that good, well that's worth something, but it'd be better if they could say why it's so good and what's wrong with it. And that's part of sort of my contribution to the whole DEF thing. I think we should organize ourselves into a feedback loop to deliver information into government agencies that are doing R&D, because they need the feedback that people like you could provide, because they don't know.
I think by high bandwidth, you mean receiving on high bandwidth, not transmitting on high bandwidth, right?
I'm actually thinking about, anybody in here in electrical engineering, you know what a gain bandwidth product is for an op-amp? It's too far to explain right now, but high bandwidth has to do with a person who is a high bandwidth person can receive and transmit a lot of information. You are a high bandwidth group. The speed at which Ben gave his introductory remarks was so fast, and I looked around the room and everybody got it. All of you were going at the speed that he was going. That's what I mean by high bandwidth. Like, smart. Really smart. I think there might be more slides, is there? Yeah. So here's the stream. So there's this group called DARPA. They invent all this technology. There's this other group called the Consumer Electronics Organization. They put on the CES show. There's another group called the IEEE. So these three groups have large populations. They're all part of the innovation dance. IEEE writes the standards, CEA makes the products, DARPA invents research. You guys could be part of the feedback loop so that what these three people are doing are calibrated to reality. Because they sometimes create systems that they lay on you guys to use in the field, and they don't do the right thing because they didn't ask you what to do. Instead, they asked you to validate it. They made it, they sent it to you, they said, do you like it? And you go, not so much. But what if they asked you before they gave it to you, well, how do you want it to be? So I think I'm done.